This is Jim Kuiper. I'm from Argonne National Laboratory, and today I'm going to be talking about the Energy Zones Mapping Tool, giving you some updates about the modeling that we've been doing and other recent activities. The Energy Zones Mapping Tool is a public web-based mapping application, and it was initially developed for the Eastern Interconnection, which is the blue area on the map. That's the grid that serves most of the eastern U.S. and parts of Canada east of the Rockies. Originally, it was developed with the leadership of the Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council, and 3 national laboratories teamed up to develop the tool and develop models and decide which data were the best, etc. And those labs are listed there: Argonne, Oak Ridge, and National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And for several years now, we've also been collaborating with Sandia National Laboratory, primarily on energy water related work that ties in with this project. Also, ICEPIC has now become part of the National Council on Electricity Policy, and the tool itself is being extended to the full U.S. So the scope of the parent organization and the tool itself is getting larger. The whole work is funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, and they're newly named the Office of Electricity Delivery. So overall, the tool provides a large data repository. It has suitability models that help you look at areas that are suitable for different types of power plants, and also corridor routes. It has a reporting capability where you can designate an area on the map of interest, and it'll generate data from the database on a certain topic for that location. And the policy information is still in the tool. It hasn't been updated, and we're getting ready to discontinue serving that information, but currently that's accessible from the home page. The major milestones are that the project was first launched, or the site was first launched in 2012, and about a year later, access was extended to the public. The study with the title page showing there was completed in 2013, and that was the end of the main work that the 3 labs were collaborating on. At that time, the Office of Electricity Delivery began continuing to fund the maintenance and the updates of the tool, as well as some enhancements. And as time has gone on, they've provided funding to extend the mapping library to the full U.S. extent. And then this year, we're digging into the modeling capabilities, which I think will be pretty intriguing to some of the folks out west that haven't had access to the models previously. The scope of the energy resources is shown here. Really, most of the major sources of generating power in the U.S. are part of the tool in some form, and so the scope has a wide range of different types of energy and generation. And within those categories are many subcategories. For example, for wind, we have models for onshore or land-based and offshore models that have different siting factors. So, as I mentioned, the models are being extended. So the graphic at the upper right shows that the change in the grid extent, and it does extend offshore. The grid is actually rectangular. Obviously, the near shore areas would be the most applicable and typically for wind generation. But there is a pressure geothermal model that's in the Gulf of Mexico, and we expect quite a bit of interesting things to come out of the West Coast offshore wind, as well as solar in the Southwest and other things that are happening out west. So the model that's shown at the lower left is a typical example of the heat map that's generated by one of these models, with the blacks and blues being low suitability and oranges and reds being high suitability. And this is a preliminary example because we're still adding some of the siting factors to the model for the full 48 states. Habitat and protected lands are still being worked on, so that model doesn't have all the siting factors as the original Eastern Interconnect model. And then at the lower right, the graphic just shows a zoomed in portion with model results. The orange and reds on that coincide with some existing solar facilities. And it's a bit of an iterative process to develop the models and get them tweaked so that they are pretty reliable for generating results that correlate with good siting locations. But you can run the models now, and we're actually looking for your input as we work on the siting factors, because we realize there's some unique characteristics out west and new data sets, in particular federal land, we're going to be adding. And one question is whether that should be a part of the default model, the jurisdiction of land, or if it should just be an alternative layer that you could add yourself. In the modeling catalog, each of the ones in this bulleted list are separate modeling layers, and each one of them is something like the one at the top right. It has a 250 meter resolution, and it has some sort of quantitative measure that can be tied to suitability. So the one that's shown there is really proximity to a transmission line. And we have multiple layers for transmission lines because different scales of projects and different types of technologies typically connect to different size substations as they're tapping into the grid. So if you have a nuclear power plant, 115 kV line isn't going to be sufficient. Whereas if you have a solar plant, you might have difficulty connecting to a 500 kV line. You might prefer to scale that down, and it would have added cost to connect to a high capacity transmission line. Anyway, some of those things are accounted for in the modeling layers as well as the model configurations. There's also the mapping catalog. Currently has over 300 layers in it, and that's one of the, it's not a very complicated aspect of the tool, but it's a very useful resource because the data sets have been vetted and identified by subject matter experts over time, and they really concentrate on not only the energy resources, the central focus of the tool, but other layers that are significant as siting factors when you're considering a new power plant. So a group, a consulting group, or a federal agency or an individual would be hard put to generate a data set with that many layers in it. But not only can you access them readily in the tool, but the majority of them are downloadable so that you can take them into your own system. And I've highlighted some of the ones that I'll show in the demo too. NERC region boundaries, there's a new map for that. And I'm not aware of a GIS data source for that, so that one was created using the graphic and made into a GIS layer, so we think that'll be useful to a few folks that may need that. And then the transmission lines are from Platts. It's a commercial data source. It's a pretty high quality data set. It's not 100% accurate, but it's fairly good. And it provides very detailed mapping of transmission lines. So that has been licensed for use in the tool, and we get quarterly updates of the Platts transmission line data. And there was recently a lot of announcements about wind turbine existing locations data, and that has been recently updated here too. Many of you have seen the newsletter we sent out. The model siting factors are being worked on, and this is a really good opportunity while we're working on these modeling layers and putting a lot of attention on them to provide feedback about ones to consider or adjustments to make. So what we have presently in those two graphics, on the left is the Eastern Interconnection model, which is still in the tool. You can see at the bottom it has protected lands and habitat, and the preliminary one for the West, or the full 48 states, doesn't have those in the model yet. But we're using the same layers in the models, but we are extending their geographic extent. So if you have any feedback, you can send that by email, you can comment during the webinar. Feel free to contact us in any way. If there seems to be a lot of interest in working together on that and having a group, then we'll spin up an advisory group and schedule some either web-based meetings or some means of working together.
Hey, Jim, it's Jim Bartridge at the California Energy Commission.
Yes.
I'm just wondering on the Platts transmission lines, you mentioned a license on those, but otherwise you suggested things were downloadable. Are those transmission lines also downloadable? Or
that's an exception, and license doesn't allow us to distribute the data, but it does allow us to depict it in the tool and allow you to query it, to use it in models, and that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and that's part of the terms of an agreement that you click on when you launch the tool. There's a block about that, just acknowledging that the proprietary or nature of that data.
Okay, and so this is the same tool here you guys are using on the 368 corridors, yes?
No, there's actually another website, and
oh, okay.
Yeah, it's called the Section 368 Energy Corridor Mapping Tool, and there are some parallel data in the two tools.
Similarities. Okay, good.
Yeah, but that one is funded by the Bureau of Land Management. This one is by DOE.
Very good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so this is the home page, easymt.anl.gov, and we do have a news section. We started updating it recently. We hadn't put out some news items for a little while, or newsletters, but we're going to be doing more of that and trying to keep the information flowing. And then to access the tool, there's a registration process. I've logged in, so there's my account menu here, but normally when you first reach the web page, it has a register link there. So if you haven't registered already, that's the process. We need to verify your email before we can give you access, so there's a second step that you should expect to receive in your email. And if anything goes wrong in that process, or it takes a long time to get a response, more than a day, for example, feel free to just email us and we'll correct the problem. So I've already logged in. And when the tool launches, it generally doesn't have any information on the map unless you have already logged in and added some layers yourself. I have some in the table of contents that I'm going to be showing, but first I'll just demonstrate bringing in one of the layers that I talked about earlier. So the mapping library is this first tool, and you can sort these columns, and if you hover over the title, you can apply a filter. So if I type NERC, then I can isolate certain layers. Obviously, it helps to know what you're looking for. So if you're new to the tool, you might start by scrolling through the tool, or maybe filtering by category if there's certain types of categories you're most interested in, and that should help you get a good start. Okay, so here's that NERC map, and for any of the layers on the map, the Identify tool will let you bring up information about the location you click on. If you have multiple layers on the map, it might have multiple sections that you can expand and contract to get at the information. Also, sometimes in dense layers, it might have multiple records that you would get into that info when you click on it. Okay, let's take a look at the wind turbine data. So here's the wind turbine database. Interestingly, the Southeast has essentially no wind turbines, and after the hurricane, you can kind of understand why. There's also the wind resource isn't as prevalent in the Southeast, but this is an excellent data set. If I zoom in to one of these locations, these are mapped down to the individual turbines, so it's pretty remarkable to be able to bring up the imagery base map and see the extent of the wind farm there. So this is based on, it originates from the process of any tower needs to be permitted by the FAA. So that generates a pretty detailed location, and then that data has been quite a bit enhanced by other groups. So you can then pick one of these wind turbines and get all kinds of information about it. So those are a couple quick examples of layers in the tool and what's been updated. I'll be showing some others as we talk about the modeling and that sort of thing too. When you're running a model, you use the Analyze tool, and it has two sections to it, one for the models and one for reports. Corridor models run with the center tool, corridors. I won't be running, we haven't updated the corridor layers yet, but so I'll be concentrating on power plant models today, but that tool works similarly to this one, except that first you generate a corridor suitability map, and then you choose a route, two endpoints, and it'll generate a route between them that has the highest suitability based on that suitability map. So the new models that we're working on are at the bottom here: solar, utility scale photovoltaic, and concentrating solar power. And to run those, you click on the gear icon, and it generates a new dialog. And these are the layers that we have ready and configured in the tool right now. If you click the gear icon on any of these, then you see the individual siting factors that apply to that layer. So in this example, this solar resource layer is based on tilted photovoltaic potential, and that's data that NREL generated. And there's different amounts of power that per square meter that are in that layer. And obviously, as that increases, you would have higher and higher suitability. So you can change any of the layers or the weights, these weights here, or the siting factors. These values range from 0 to 100, and 0 being completely unsuitable. If you have a 0, it'll render the whole map unsuitable in that location. And you can delete a layer if you want to remove it from the model, and you can open this, and like we have to work on some configuration here. Normally that would include the layers that are available to add. I'll show you that in a minute because we have that working for a model that you designed from scratch. Then you can run, if you run a draft model, it uses a 1 kilometer resolution, and it takes much less time to compute. That's good for testing and kind of iterating with some adjustments to the siting factors. And once you feel you're pretty confident, you like the model, then you can run a final model. And this checkbox just means to add the model to the map when it finishes running. So when you launch one of these, it goes to the results. So I've got a pretty lengthy list of results in my dialog here, but the ones you'll have are the system models. You'll have those all by default. We've run them all for you in advance. And then anything you run, it's added to that. And it works similar to the layers dialog, where you can filter by name if you want, or sort by other fields. And by default, it has the most recent runs listed first. So you usually want those, and you'd find them at the top of the dialog. To see the map, you would click on this to add it to the map if it wasn't added automatically. And You can delete the model, you can change the name and the notes, you can rerun a model with a new change to the sighting factors, and there's a model results report that you can launch to kind of look more specifically at the results for a particular location on the map that you are interested in. Okay, so if we take a look at the utility scale PV map, zoom to it, or too far, and then make it transparent. So we can overlay that on the base map. And denser urban areas would be ruled out by the model. Steeper slopes, you can see that some of that happening out west. And as you look at the results, you can kind of correlate them with the sighting factors and see what led to a high or low suitability value. And then one of the helpful things to do is to add power plants layer. This I've already had it in my table of contents. This layer is from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, which is part of DOE. And the orange in this map, those are solar plants. So some of the real rapid development of solar is in the southwest. And just as an example, there's some major projects here kind of on, as you're driving along I-10 in California, you'll see them. Let me switch to the imagery. So you can see it's coming up as high suitability with the model. So at least we've got that working for us. And here's a PV plant that we can find with our power plants layer and then see on the image. And it is registering as high suitability with the model. There are some solar plants in the model that are coming up as low suitability, and we're going to look at that and try to get it tweaked. Here, for example, you've got low suitability in some block, and we need to kind of check and see why that's happening, whether it's just a special case that, or whether that's a general setting that we want to try to tweak and make it work better for us. But as you can see, the model's got a lot of variability to it, and you can change it yourself. So it's not a final answer. It's really a iterative tool that you would use to study some of the sighting parameters you have of interest and hopefully get some intriguing results. And then there's also this concentrating solar power plant layer. And one of the sighting factors that originally went into that was availability of water. And we recognize that groundwater, it's really a surface water layer. That's one that you might want to play around with, because it wouldn't be out of the question to have one of those plants in an area. They don't have a real high water requirement, but these plants do have some needs for water, for example, to clean the heliostats or the mirrors that point towards the center tower and that sort of thing. So why don't we zoom out and look at the national results for that. And so the effect of these bands here, I believe that's either transmission lines or water sources that are causing that. And we're going to be looking at the sighting factors and adjusting them as we go on to see if we can get them tuned up really well. If there are any questions, I'd like to open up for that.
Will you be having these webinars?
Yes, our goal is to have them roughly quarterly, but we're just really ramping up on the updates now, and so we may have them more frequently the next few months as we get some, like once we get these models working well, I definitely want to start showing those, and especially some of the unique aspects of areas out west. Federal
Okay.
land is going to be a siting factor. There's active work on energy corridors that we're involved in, and I'd like to kind of look at the corridor modeling capability in the west in conjunction with those designated corridors and see if it's helping with generating good routes.
You seem to have read my mind. My
Okay.
next question, if I can, is when we did a land screening 5 years ago on a DOE-funded project, the most aggravating thing was the checkerboard maps and figuring out whose checkerboard map was authoritative and up to date. And I came in just after the top of the hour, and it looked like a checkerboard map was just going off screen.
Okay.
So do you, obviously you know what I mean. The ones that show tribe control, state control, BLM, etc. in square mile blocks. So my question is, how thorough are they and how up to date are they? We found, for example, that our map, our checkerboard of the Navajo reservation, is actually more up to date and authoritative than the BLM zone map.
Okay. And what area are you working in, or what's your organization?
Farmington, near about 30 miles south of Farmington, New Mexico. So you're in near the Four Corners.
Okay.
So zoom in. It's place called the Denazine Wilderness. It's off Highway 371. You can see the dog leg.
This area?
Right near the bottom of your map. You see 371, and there's a blue square right next to it. That blue square actually is one of our... Yes. Here, you've got it.
Okay.
And just zoom in one more click. So you can see how complicated the checkerboarding is. And that was a fairly aggravating issue 5 years ago. We wish this tool had been available. And if it was available, I'm pretty embarrassed. But it looks fabulous now. I'm wondering, this BLM data, how old is it that you're pulling it from?
Yeah, we work with the BLM quite a bit, and they are the agency that is tasked with maintaining a federal land jurisdictional layer.
Mm-hmm.
In their terminology, it's called Surface Management Agency. So they do have subsurface management too that isn't reflected in that map. And we do see some discrepancies with the local data or inaccuracies in it. And in the scale of the project that we're in here, it's more we're showing their data. We've gotten the most recent version that was among the recently updated layers, but we don't really have the role of correcting it or making updates.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. So, and then as far as BLM as an organization, they do a lot of their work at the field office level, and they have the least funding of any federal agency per square mile of lands they manage. So they have quite a difficult task to maintain all that, but I don't envy them. But I do hope for continued improvement in the quality of that.
Yeah. The brown and orange parts are correct. The wilderness is correct, but the blue and white parts are different.
That would be state land.
State and private.
Yep. So this layer is one that we'll make a modeling layer, and we're not, for different types of projects, you might seek out, if you're doing an energy project on tribal land and you're trying to site a project on tribal land, you would be able to to show that as high suitability. In other cases, you would want to have a low suitability for tribal land if you are trying to stay on federal or other jurisdictions. So the default settings for it might be kind of problematic because it just completely depends on what you're trying to do. But some lands, like national parks, are typically protected and would generally be low suitability for energy projects.
Are the defaults discoverable by the user? I mean, easily discoverable?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that would be when you go to one of these models. I don't have the federal land layer here, but land cover area is an example similar.
Yeah, okay.
And each one listed by name and then has a suitability factor assigned to it. But these are defaults, but you can change them.
I see.
Yeah, and once you've changed them and run a model, then that model preserves your settings, and you can start with that one so you don't have to keep changing it. Okay, there was a question on the chat, and one person, Sarah, asking if we are tracking who is using the tool and how they are using it. Are there case studies from back east? The registration information is self-reported, but we prompt for organization and job title and state. That's kind of our basis. Correlate that by type of organization or sector. So we've done some statistics about that, and we have quite a wide range of stakeholder communities involved, everything from universities to individuals and NGOs and different levels of government, etc. There's a number of users that would be from each of those groups. How people are using the tool, I mean, we can count how many models have been run or reports. We don't usually dig too deep into that because it's hard to parse out of the data. But as far as, testimonials of this is what I did with it and how I added value, that's something that the sponsor and we are very interested in hearing because we'd like to know that it's being used and how it's being used. But we don't have a lot of that information. And when we've asked for it in the past, we haven't gotten a lot of responses aside from really like your tool or something. So if anybody has some of that commentary, hopefully positive, but it is also a way that we get bug reports. We'd like to hear it, so we'd welcome that input. Okay, another question on the chat from Ryan, is this tool entirely free or are there tiers where users will pay a license fee, for example? It is a free resource, and I would say the way to ensure it still remains is to provide feedback that we can forward to the sponsor and let them know that you're getting value out of the tool. And then am I aware of circumstances where utilities are using this tool in conjunction with their modeling and planning? Yes, in some cases. One very specific inquiry was whether a utility could use maps that they created with the EZMT for a bid, and that kind of got into the allowable use of the transmission data from Platts being on the map, and that was deemed by Platts even as an acceptable use. The data in the tool could be used for that purpose. We did have a visit to EEI one time, and there are some other groups where we dug a little deeper and gave them detailed demonstrations and kind of basic training on use of the tool. So we've had some interactions like that. So those are some along those lines. Opportunities to integrate data from the EZMT with utility company GIS data sets. The data flow from that obviously can go from the EZMT to their systems because most of the data can be downloaded. There's been some discussion about having the ability to add your own layers into the tool. That hasn't gotten to the point that it's been funded, but it's been posed as an enhancement. Okay, I've got another question from Tom. A lot of recent interest in the energy-water nexus. Can you give us any examples about how the tool can be used to identify relationships between energy and water? Yeah, there's quite a bit there. In particular, we've been partnering with Sandia National Laboratory, and some of the data that they've developed that's specifically focused on energy water is hosted in the tool. And it's comprised of a single layer that has hydrologic unit boundaries or watersheds as its units. As far as the data catalog, it comes up as a multiple series of layers because you can see different variables more easily. That is probably the first example I'd like to point out about that. So, for example, let's look at surface water areas of concern and water availability for fresh surface water. And this data set includes projections for future water use, changes in consumption, and things like that. So for those of you that are less into energy and water, there are many overlaps between the water quality and availability and power generation. On one side, you have hydropower that's used to generate power, and on the other hand, you have cooling water that might be consumed by a power plant and needs to be available. There may be a temperature that they cannot exceed or water quality standard for it. So all these different things play into how power plants, how efficient they are and how suitable they are for the location they're in. Then you've got other impacts from water, like flooding, that impact energy delivery. Just, for example, the hurricanes that we've had have disrupted power systems. There's many correlations between energy and water. A quick way to kind of look at the scope of energy and water data in the tool is to filter by category. And there is a hydrography category. And this lists many of the other data sets that are in the tool. So you have basic ones like water bodies and streams. You've got physical energy facilities like pump storage sites. Those are used for storing energy, really. There's hydrokinetic projects. This hydro run-of-the-river data was generated in Argonne recently, is funded by Energy Water Funds. Aquifer areas is more just a basic resource of where are aquifers in the U.S. We've got NREL data for wave energy. There's also tidal power density data that's generated along the coastlines where you might put hydrokinetic projects. Aqueduct water risk is something that the World Resources Institute created. It's a little bit similar to the Sandia data, but it's actually part of a global data set. So they've got another angle on water risk, the risk of availability for water for different purposes. That's another interesting data set. Yes, and we have a comment from Sarah. Would be interested in talking about habitat data layers on the west side. So feel free to just email ezmt@anl.gov. We're planning to use the chat data for the western part of the modeling habitat layer. So that's in progress. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much. Excellent webinar.